Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and I'm here today with Joanne Diaz.
Hi, my name is Joanne Diaz, and I am a poet living in central Illinois. I teach at a small liberal arts college called Illinois Wesleyan University, and I am really delighted to be talking with you, Ethan.
All right, let's get straight into the question. So I just want to start off with this. I think it's a good starter question just because it's so universal, which is how did you find out about poetry? Why did you start writing it as opposed to just reading it or hearing about it?
You know, my story is probably a very familiar one. I owe it all to my teachers. So in high school, I had a teacher named Kathy Breen, who was a remarkable woman. She started a literary magazine at my high school. I had her in junior year of high school, and she encouraged us to try our hand at poetry. She liked some of what I was writing and some of the work I was doing on that literary magazine. And this just shows you how remarkable teachers can be. She found out about the Bread Loaf Young Writers Conference in Middlebury, Vermont, and she brought me and two of my friends up there in a giant school-owned van, for a few days of amazing workshops that were comprised of high school students from all over the country. And that was an amazing introduction for me into a world that I didn't know that people still wrote poems. Like I saw poems in anthologies and they were mostly written 200 years ago by people in Europe. I didn't really, I had no sense that poetry was alive, that poets were alive, that it was an evolving sort of thing. But she helped me see that at that point in my life. And then from there, I just continued to love reading and writing. I was excited about it. So that when I got to college, I entered college in 1990. So back in the Stone Age. And the reason that part of the story is important is because when you used to register for classes, you got your schedule on like a dot matrix printer that like printed in like Courier font. And I didn't get into a poetry workshop that I really wanted to get into with a wonderful poet named Marie Howe. And she's still alive. She's still just fantastic poet. And so I lied. I lied to get into the class. When she called the roster, I said, no, no, there must be some mistake. I'm in your class. And I wasn't on her roster. And eventually a couple students dropped out and there was room for me. But I just wanted so desperately to be in her presence because she was very intense and inspiring and inspired by just writing words on the page. And I just thought that was a terrific thing to do with one's time. And I just continued from there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with having good English teachers being a really fortunate way to be introduced to poetry. I mean, it was because of my teachers that I started writing poetry in the first place. And it was because of a really good teacher I had in 10th grade who really helped me discover, oh, yeah, this is all the different kind of contemporary poetry I can look at. Because before then, all I had known is, like you said, the old European guys 200 years ago, right? So it really was getting started and just getting straight into it like that.
Yeah, and that's so important for young people to have access to contemporary poetry and poetics as soon as possible. And when I say young people, I mean 5 years old. I mean, as soon as you start speaking and reading and writing, you should have access to what people of your own lifetime are concerned with and are speaking back to. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, it really is kind of, if you think about it, now kids read novels written when they were already alive, and they read news stories, they read nonfiction from the time of when they were born and in their same modern era. But for
Yeah.
some reason, we just never get there with poetry. It's always Wordsworth or Longfellow, right? But
Right. And if it's almost a reverse engineering. So I became an English major because of my love for creative writing workshops. The creative writing workshops were actually the place where I learned how to read closely and carefully and really get into a poem. And from that experience, I could then go to my literature classes that focused on Shakespeare or Chaucer or other really authors from the deep past. And I could see things differently because of my study of contemporary poetry. And I would just say, too, we have this tendency to think that only contemporary poets are the ones that are politically engaged or concerned with ecological crisis or social justice issues, when in fact, once you have anchored yourself into some of those contemporary poets who have those concerns, you can actually see that they're part of a long story of politically engaged poetry. And I love seeing that because then the story of literary history becomes really bumpy and complex.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are so many movements of poetry which we have detached from their current times, especially like I think the most obvious one at this point to point out is like transcendentalism. Those people were very politically connected with their time. And now we kind of observe it out of context and we go, oh, this is just good writing. But that's not all it was. And that right now is definitely not all it is, right?
No, that's absolutely right. And you mentioned the transcendentalists, many of whom were abolitionists, for example, right?
Yeah.
I read a cultural biography of Walt Whitman, and the author, David Reynolds, he cited a statistic. I don't remember where he got it, but he said something like about 5% of all Americans in the mid 1800s supported the abolition of slavery. About 5%. Many were opposed. Many knew that it was morally bankrupt as an institution, but only a tiny percent were actual abolitionists that wanted to create an upheaval in this unjust system. And that blew my mind because that really teaches me how radical some of those writers really were.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about context of the time and how it felt then, as opposed to it's easy to look in hindsight about certain things.
Oh,
But
yes. Right.
I just want to branch kind of off of that, which is when we're talking about all these different themes that inspired historical writers to actually write and how they're connected to their moment and how writers now are connected to their moment. What for you was your connection when you wrote your own poetry? Like, what did you write about? What connected you to your moment?
That's an interesting question because that's changed over time. So when I started writing poems, many of them would probably fall into what is now called a more confessional mode. I was very concerned with relationships, with family, with exploring where I had come from, who I was. And many of my poems were very small and taut. And I was looking for an economy of language so that the poems were very controlled because the poems I was reading often looked like that and sounded like that. And I thought that's what poetry was supposed to sound like. And that went okay for a while. But I felt dissatisfied by it because actually I'm very concerned with politics and history. And there was a point at which a friend of mine from my MFA program at New York University said to me, "Well, why don't you just write the way you sound? Why don't you just write the way you speak? What's the worst that could happen?" That was such an insightful moment for me because it's a really challenging question. Is poetry supposed to sound or look different from speech? And if so, how? What parts of our sound do we want to convey on the page or on the stage, right? And I liked that she challenged me with that question, and it actually helped me crack open my poems. And write about the things I cared about most. And so a lot of my poetry is informed by research. I am always reading before I write. Um, and what happens is I feel like a lot of poets do this. I know I do. I'm always trying to arrange the pieces of the puzzle? So I have all these disparate parts that I know I want to connect, and I keep drafting and revising poems until those pieces can come together, whether it's through an argument or whether it's through a contradiction or an admission that I was initially wrong, and then I understand something through the process of writing. So I feel like quite often when I'm sitting down to write, I'm trying to put some pieces of a puzzle together that feel separate but then come together in the poem.
Yeah, I definitely have felt that from time to time when I'm writing my own poems. I have little bits and pieces. It'll be a failed project here or a semi-started one here, and then I eventually think, well, these can come together, and I make something more whole out of that, right?
So that's interesting what you say. So would you say then that that requires some patience on your part, because if you have this piece that you know has potential, you might have to kind of sit on that back burner for a few weeks or a few months before it finds a home in the right poem?
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing is like I have this impatience and I apply it to a lot of things that I do in my life, which is that if I get started on something, I feel really dissatisfied if I don't immediately finish it. But sometimes when I'm writing something, there's quite literally I feel as if there's quite literally no way for me to finish it at that time and still be satisfied with the product. So I just have to leave it as it is. And that kind of builds up over time.
So that's a real argument for being patient, but also embracing idleness sometimes. Like, because what you're describing, it's like you're so eager to like just get it done and get the movement on the page. But sometimes you need to walk away from the page and just be in life for a while. And then that clicking can happen that could never have happened if you just kind of doggedly kept going at it, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think the way you think about things when you're not trying to write something, it's how I end up coming up with lines that I later I'm like, wow, that's a really good line. But I wasn't sitting there in front of the page looking at the paper when when I thought of it. I was just like walking around, and then it pops into my head.
So that just happened to me a couple of days ago. A few weeks ago, I read an article in the New York Times about awe and vastness and how powerful it can be. We tend to think that you have to go to like the Grand Canyon or something to experience vastness and awe. But the article was suggesting that you could just be in your own neighborhood and probably find an open space or some small, beautiful thing that takes you outside of yourself for a moment to feel that awe. And they were recommending that we try to look for that every day because it has very powerful psychological benefits. And I forgot about that article as soon as I read it. I was busy. But just a few days ago, I was on a road trip and I went to the ocean for the first time in a year and a half, 2 years maybe. And I remembered the article and I was like, I have to make that article and this ocean come together. I don't know how yet, but I know that, so I felt that movement and that was very exciting. So we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I definitely understand. And I've taken walks from time to time to try to capture that. And I think the way whenever I take a walk, I usually can kind of produce a lot better than usual. I just I just want to branch off a bit
Yeah.
from our earlier discussion, which was you talk a lot about the stories, your interest in history and politics. I've noticed, how do you use history or myths or folklore or all of that kind of stuff as fuel for your poems? How do you use them in your poems?
I am regularly amazed by how much I don't know. I am a lifelong learner, that is for sure. And there is so much richness and complexity in the world that regularly stimulates me. And I have groups of concerns, one of which is the nature of violence, not just violence between individuals, but mass, like state violence, for example, right? Whether that be civil war, whether that be genocide, the violence that we do to the environment. Um, and I'm very concerned by the fact that it never seems to end. I was once in a book group in which we read an amazing book by Elaine Scarry. It's called The Body in Pain. And she's looking at all kinds of pain, whether it be pain from illness, pain related to state sanctioned torture practices. And in this book group, there were several individuals who read the book and they were alarmed. Their general response to this book was, I can't believe how horrible the world is. I can't imagine how people think of these things. And that was actually a jumping off point for my second book of poetry, My Favorite Tyrants. The disbelief of those readers in that book club interested me. I thought, well, but it's happening all the time. Why can't you believe it? Why can't you see that this could in fact be the default mode for humans who are poor, human life, which is poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and why can't we find a better way? And so I'm very interested in the bystanders of history who don't say no to state sanctioned violence. I have concerns about that in myself. When do I stand up to that violence and when don't I? And I'm very interested in implicating myself when I don't, right? So I'm very interested in creating a poetic speaker who falls short a lot. And so on the one hand, yes, I want to provide a critique in the poem or provide a moment of exposure of this kind of violence. But I also want to point the finger to myself and ask myself, well, what would I do in this situation? Am I ready to um, insert myself into a difficult situation? Sometimes the answer is no. And I try to address that in my poetry. So one example of that would be the Spanish Civil War, which is not something that many Americans know about. And now that all of those soldiers have died, a lot of that history will die too. And we could talk about for this whole half hour just about the Spanish Civil War. But I've been to Spain many times. I am of Spanish descent. I lived in Spain for several months a few years ago. And it's something that's on my mind a lot because it was the precursor to World War II and the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s. And the ease with which Francisco Franco took over in 1939 and ruled for over 40 years until 1975 or 76, I believe. And the tyranny that he exercised during that time, and the many hundreds of thousands of Spaniards that just vanished and were killed and put in mass graves during that time. That is something that I think about a lot, and it is not unique, right? So what happened in Spain, it happens in countries all over the world, and I'm always drawn to trying to understand that, um, just on a personal level, and then how to incorporate that into poetry.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as a way to approach this kind of idea, even just as a concept, the idea of mass violence, state violence, all these kinds of things, I think have, for the most part, throughout my life, as the way I've been taught it or the way I've been fed it is through textbooks as footnotes where they say like, oh yeah, Francisco Franco killed this many people before the Spanish Civil War, or like the fascists and the Communist Party, and then they just describe these conflicts in very much like detail, as in numbers and groups almost. But it's very hard to perceive it in a way which makes you realize that our current moment is full of that same kind of uh, same historical concept of state violence now. It's not just something that happened when like Hitler was in power or when Lenin or Stalin was in power. It's something that's happening even like possibly right now in the US or in China or all these kinds of places where you don't think of it. And I think it's really interesting that you're approaching that with poetry, because poetry as a medium, I think, really lends itself to that kind of those kinds of realizations and that kind of emotional kind of development of these ideas, besides just on a very base level of realizing it happened.
I think that's right. I think you're touching upon an important point. And, hearing you talk, I can't help but think of an internship I had many years ago. I worked at a place called Facing History and Ourselves. And this is one of their concerns, right? How do these things happen? It's not just about dates and numbers, like you say, right? How do individuals end up making collective decisions that are morally repugnant and unjust, right? And are not really supporting, um, uh, that are not in everyone's best interest. It does damage to us all. And I think I've been thinking about it ever since I worked at that organization, and I suspect I will continue to think about it because, as you say, it's entirely relevant to our cultural moment right now.
Yeah. Just finishing up with the questions, I just wanted to ask you. So you talked a little bit about how when you were first introduced to just writing how you speak, you were kind of, I guess, amazed by the power that that had. So how now do you think we should look at the interaction between traditional forms and more contemporary forms? What do you think their respective places are in a modern world of poetry?
I feel like we're in a golden age of poetry right now. I'm so excited to be alive to see it, precisely because we are more able than ever before to lift away from the page and return to what poetry should be, which is an oral spoken tradition. Of course, we should enjoy it on the page. Of course, we should read magazines and books. That's a wonderful way to ingest poetry. But there are so many other ways. We can follow our favorite poets on Instagram. We can watch button poetry videos. We can watch YouTube videos or go to live events on Zoom calls now because of the pandemic, which is one of the great things because you could be anywhere in the world and go listen to one of your favorite poets read their work. So I would say that I don't know how to answer the question because for me, yes, I'm a literature professor. And yes, my backdrop is full of books, but so what? You know, books are great, but so is the human voice. And I think that any contemporary poet owes a big debt to the spoken word performance poetry tradition because so much of what performance poets are doing rhetorically, dramatically, has completely filtered into so much of what's happening on the page and on the stage. And it's wonderful. It's very exciting.
All right, thank you. If you feel ready, you can go ahead and read a poem or two now.
All right, maybe I'll read a poem. Let me go to my page here. I might read a poem that speaks to one of my points earlier. We were talking about state-sanctioned violence, how it is that so many people are bystanders to that violence, and just the long arc of history. The poem I'm going to read is called Septimania, and it draws from two sources. One is Adam Hochschild. He's a wonderful journalist and historian. He wrote a book about the Spanish Civil War a few years ago. It's called Spain in Our Hearts. The other source that I cite in this poem is George Orwell, who fought in the Spanish Civil War. He was a British writer, of course, but he fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he wrote a memoir of that, and it's called Homage to Catalonia. And so you'll see how that all comes together in this poem. Septimania. When I check to see which exit I should use when emerging from the Lesseps metro stop, the map says Septimania, and instead of thinking of that ancient borderland that once existed between France and Spain, I remember the septic tank at the center of my childhood backyard, the contents of which were so full of our excrement that our grass glowed emerald green for decades until the town managers decided to create whole rivers of putrefaction streaming underneath the road into sewage systems that would have made ancient Romans proud. I take Septimania, emerge from the bowels of the earth, walk 290 meters, and arrive at the door of my son's preschool, where he has been baking bread for the past hour. There's something so precious about the lightness of that activity, all that leavening and rising, that I laughed when the headmaster told me about 3-year-olds baking bread every day. He looked at me and said, "Why are you laughing? The bread is delicious." Yes, headmaster. Yes to lightness and rising, even if I needed to wade through putrefaction to get to it. On an ordinary day, rottenness is trending. But in the days since the inauguration, excrement has become all the rage. One day of news from America is enough to convince anyone of that. It seems, though, that war has always been a magnet for fundament. Just today, I was rereading George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and I marveled at his attention to diarrhea, decaying food, and the horse dung of the Spanish Civil War. Later, I learned from Adam Hochschild that the women who belonged to unions and yearned for a classless society were objects of such enmity that everything needed to be taken from them. Sometimes the soldiers took their newborns. Sometimes Franco's soldiers tattooed the women's flesh with the yoke and arrows of the phalangists. Sometimes the soldiers gang raped the women and then bragged about it to anyone who would listen. Sometimes, if the women still resisted the power of tyranny, they were forced to drink castor oil, a powerful laxative, and then parade through the streets being jeered as they soiled themselves. Today is another beautiful day, radiant with Mediterranean sun, even in January. My son and I walked to Plaza del Diamante, the site of the old air raid shelter, and a bronze statue of a woman whose naked body seems to rise and break through the earth. At first, her pose suggests that she is an emblem of freedom, but no. Her stance is one of both terror and amazement. The bronze eviscerates her body, breaking it in two. In the plaza, we do what all the other families do: play crazy car with his balance bike, buy candy at the supermarket, then descend again into the underworld of the metro, as if everyone knows what happened here and who belonged to whom.
Thank you. That was great.
I should mention that the inauguration was the 2017 inauguration.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's an old poem. That's like a 4-year-old poem now.
All right.
So,
Okay, that puts it into context for me. Yeah.
yeah, okay.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Do you want to read another one?
Yeah, let me try to pick one that maybe is a little bit shorter. I'm going to finish by reading a poem called Lavender. And this poem, um, I'm very interested in Elaine Scarry. I mentioned her before, but she has another beautiful book called On Beauty and Being Just. And I'm very interested in how she talks about beauty as sometimes having its foundations in an error. So sometimes you think something is beautiful, but then you realize later it's not. Or sometimes you have an initial encounter with something and you think it's ugly, and then you realize later that it's beautiful. And then the other element of that is that she's very interested in copying beauty. We have this desire to copy things that are beautiful, and she has a whole sort of treatise on that. There are two sources that I cite in this poem. One is Deborah Diggs. She was a poetry teacher of mine many years ago. So I begin with an epigraph by Deborah Diggs, and then I refer to Vibrant Matter, which is a title of a book by a political philosopher who's very interested in the energy of ordinary objects, Jane Bennett. Lavender. The air is alive with our failure. Deborah Diggs. At first, they might feel like a mistake, these tiny shrubs, these sisters to mint and weed, these lanceolate leaves, these etymons of the plant's name buried in laundry and funerary rites. But then in a flash, the world is all Cézanne, all barn in a purple field, and you climb to the second floor and stand with your toes on the edge to behold it. Miles of corn stalks punctuated by this profundity of lavender. Half of you might think world's end, sixth extinction, near apocalypse, but the other half will wonder, where does the hair that whips across the face become prairie? What is an acre of lavender? What is this ache? 40 can feel like days on water, a season of penitence, years of exile. It is composite and, like all such numbers, only semi-perfect, but no harm done. Sometimes it takes years to know tenderness, which, as the word implies, is its own form of currency. Today, let the mind wander and fan and even surrender to the body. Then walk through a field of lavender on this edge of before and after. Therein lies, believe it, a kind of contentment, with the body not a map or a clock, but a sprig, tightly bound and full of vibrant matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I like your range. I definitely feel the difference in like the tone and what you're going for in those two different poems. And that was great. Do you
Thank
have
you.
any closing remarks?
None, except that this is a wonderful opportunity to talk with you. I don't actually talk about these things that often about my own work. I certainly talk about them with other people's work when I'm teaching, but your questions were very interesting and I appreciated the opportunity to speak with you.
All right. Thank you.